How's it going, everybody? So, probably going to go on a little bit of a rant here, but one of the things I've been thinking about is when it comes to like alternative education and homeschooling and just education generally, one of the things that I've encountered and I've been thinking about because it seems obvious, but it doesn't really get talked about much. But what is it that we want? When you ask yourself, what are you going to teach somebody? What is it we want to teach people, right? And why, right? What is it that kids need to be learning? Um, we tend to, school districts for the past 100 years, you have this sort of framework that is basically, reading, writing, math, science, right? Maybe some creative exploits on the side, right? And when I think about this question, what do I want my kids to learn and what do kids need to, what are they supposed to be learning? Uh, I think that the way you should start approaching this question, anybody, is, what's the goal in mind? Right? Where is it you want to get to? What is it? What is your end net result that you want out of this? What's the output, right? If you want to train, when you train airplane mechanics, you know what the outcome is. You need someone that can do X, Y, and Z, and you know what to train them for because you know what you're targeting, right? So there has to be an end goal in mind, right? Because if there's no end goal, I mean, how do you train someone to do something when you don't know what you're training them for, right? If you want to be a scientist, you learn science. If you want to be a doctor, you learn, biology, medicine, chemistry, whatever, right? Lawyers will learn about legal frameworks and laws. If you're going to teach somebody, you have to have some sort of goal in mind, right? And that's the first question that has to be asked, right? And that is not really an easy question. I mean, it's the right question, I think, but it's there's a lot of answers to that, right? I mean, if you just think about it briefly, you'd be like, well, we want someone who's, they need to be exposed to math and science and reading. And you're like, well, why? Why do we want those things, right? Are those the only things that we have? And this is, to build on my last video of why school systems, set curriculums are never going to be dynamic enough to adapt to these things just by design. They cannot be, right? Because of the sort of immense variability of life and the different stages. But say you want someone, let's say your end goal is, I want someone who is, forget about math, science, and reading. Let's reframe this to, I want someone who has creative capacity, functions within an ethical framework. I want an ethical person, and I want them to be responsible and disciplined, right? And that is our framework that we're going to build towards, right? How do you build towards that? Right? Because those seem like things that maybe you want for your kids, right? Being creative, being ethical seems good, right? Being disciplined, responsible. Are those things important? Right? I think they are. Are they at least as important as biology, knowing the 3 types of muscles in your body, right? Is there some way that the school system can teach that, right? Maybe, maybe not. Can you make a curriculum for it? I think so. You could learn creativity by creating things. What's going to talk about? I mean, this is pretty straightforward, right? How do you teach these things? Like, they're not generally established in a curriculum, but I think they can be taught, right? And to sort of lean on Aristotle here is like, how do you teach creativity? How do you teach ethics? Aristotle said, in order to be good, right? How do you make good people? Essentially, you become good by doing good things and creating good habits, right? The more good things you do, the more good you become. Same way we can apply that to creativity, discipline, responsibility. You become more creative by being creating things, right? You say, all right, we'll create, a musical composition, a literary composition, some sort of math framework, whatever, right? Discipline, responsibility, become responsible by being given responsibility and having to deal with, right? And that sort of builds, like, makes sense, right? These things are still pretty straightforward. You get into you can just really complicate this, and kind of shows you the sort of the depth of the issue, right? What if I want to, what if you want to teach your kids how to make good life decisions, how to have quality relationships in their lives, how to have that, the Hemingway quote, how to have better insides so they don't go to pieces, right? How to have that sort of inner strength, perseverance, I guess you'd call it. How do you teach that? Right? Should that be a part of a curriculum? And I can tell you these things, and we would all agree that these are extremely important things, right? I would think we all want our kids to have that, right? Make good life decisions, right? Which is, I'm 43 years old. I can look across the people I've known all my life, and most of the ones that are doing badly right now is largely because they've made very poor life decisions, right? Quality relationships, hugely important in your life, right? Having people you can lean on, you can talk to, that sort of social framework. And how do you convey the importance of these things to your kids? And how do you make them, how do you teach that to them? That now you're getting into really complicated things, right? Like we all kind of want to know the answer to these, but I don't know if you can succeed in that per se, but I think it's worth trying, right? Like you're certainly not going to succeed if you don't at least try. And then now you're getting into things that no school curriculum can possibly, right, adapt to, right? I mean, we don't even know how to build these things. Like, how do you teach inner strength? Right? I would say is acclimating yourself to failure, right? Being able to bounce back from repeated failures. That's kind of inner strength. That's what gets you through life. Life has a lot of moments where it kicks your butt. And I could sort of expand on this topic endlessly, right? I mean, you can get into something like really complicated, like how do you teach your kids to show moral courage, right? When they're confronted with severe or sort of serious situations in life. The kind of thing we look at like Schindler or Irina Sendler during the Holocaust, right? Can you teach that? I don't know. But again, I go back to you have to try, right? You have to ask that initial question, what kind of person do you want your kids to be, right? Is it more than just math and science, right? Is it responsibility, relationships, these kind of things, right? So I guess, just when we go back to the original question, what should we be teaching kids? You have to decide some end goal in mind, and maybe that shifts across time, right? Maybe when you're a little kid, you just want them to learn to be polite and not make a mess at the table. And as you progress, you build on that. Obviously, teenagers, you want them doing any number of things, right, correctly, right? But the goals change, but you still have to have a goal, right? So to sort of address that first question, it's important to have a goal set in mind, and then we'll kind of work back from there. Like if you're just sort of randomly teaching, just kind of slapping in a curriculum that you found either from the school district or from, there's all sorts of options now that are really interesting. But the main takeaway is this, like you have to have a goal in mind. And whether or not that goal shifts across time, every year, every 3 years, maybe a 3-year plan, whatever. You should have a goal in mind if you want to answer the question of what should we teach kids, right? Like, and I would also argue, the next part, but it's not an easy question to solve because we're really, when you talk about subject matter, let's go on to the next part of the answer, right? The second part of this that I would address is, what is the utility of knowledge in this case, right? And by that I mean, how useful is that knowledge? So, any kind of when you're analyzing the value of any bit of knowledge or just knowledge generally, this is sort of fundamentally derived from its utility, right? It's very, knowing how to do, so this is applied in a lot of different ways, right? Knowing how to be a brain surgeon has a high amount of utility in a very narrow scope, right? But you can look at the reality of life and you find that very few people can do that, right? So it's very high demand, but just as useful, right? You know, not everybody necessarily needs to know how to, do brain surgery, right? But most everybody should know, how to cook, right? How to tell if something's rotten and don't eat it, right? That's a very high utility in a different kind of aspect, right? So there's a sort of match you have to make, just sort of realistically, right? How useful is it to know that there's 3 different kinds of muscles in the body, right? There's 3 different kinds of rocks, right, in the world. Igneous, I remember igneous, sedentary, and metamorphic. I remember that. Never used it in my life, but I remember. Is it useful to know, if you're a doctor, do you really need to know how an internal combustion engine works, right? Maybe not, right? Mechanics don't need to know all that much about the circulatory system. How to be a good motivator, a public speaker is not particularly useful to someone who's a software coder, right? These kind of things. The utility of knowledge, just very simple things. How useful is this knowledge, right? And consider that everything has an opportunity cost, right? So standard curriculums have followed this pattern of like math, science, reading, right? How much math is enough math? How much science is enough science, right? It kind of depends on what you're doing with it, right? If your kid has no interest in science whatsoever, like, what's the point of teaching them chemistry when they're 16, 17? Like, could you be teaching them something else that they would use? And that's what I mean. There's an opportunity cost, right? Math, I get into it with people all the time because we've just accepted that you have to have, X amount of math, right? And how many times have you used invisible numbers? And it's a very basic, simple question that seems obvious, but it's like, no, you need math. And math does have benefits like brain development, all that, especially, in younger years, it teaches you how to think logically. All that is true, right? But it does still have an opportunity cost because you were studying, geometric functions and algebra 2, when you were in high school. And what you didn't study was how to do your taxes, how loans work, how compound interest rates work. One of those things you are going to need to know. The other one, you're never going to use ever, right? And a lot of times, it's the, the Thomas Paine, right? Not thinking a thing wrong. It gives the superficial appearance of being right. Just doing something for years and never thinking about it gives you the impression that it's the right thing to do, right? These things have opportunity costs. And like, I've surveyed my students over years over what they wish they had been taught, right? And overwhelmingly, the number one response is some variation of real world sort of finance knowledge, right? Kind of generally like how to do my taxes, how loans work, how do I improve my credit, why do I need credit, those kind of things. They know they don't know it, they know they weren't taught it, and they know that they need to know it, and nobody taught them. And this was reflected time after time in blank survey, like just blind surveys where I said, what do you wish you'd been taught? And it's always, that's the number one response, some variation of that. It's kind of interesting little aside, but in the survey, so males and females, that was their number one response. Now, the number two response was different between men and women. For men, they tend to focus. The number two response was generally useful knowledge, like everyday useful knowledge, like basic electrical, basic plumbing, that kind of stuff that they could use every day. For women, it was psychological, generally under the rubric of psychological relationship knowledge, like how to spot someone who's a psychopath and not date them, right? And when you think about it, like that is a very useful skill to have that nobody teaches you, especially girls. And the fact that they said that, and I've had my own experiences, stuff like that. I was like, I'm absolutely going to teach my daughter, like, this is how you spot a psychopath. Don't get into relationships with these kind of people. how to maintain long-term relationships, how to get along, how to deal with depression, how to deal with, all the things that life throws at you. And it was interesting that women said that, because they're right. It's something you really do need to know. And everybody, we all just kind of figure it out. Some of us figure it out going through life. Some of us don't. Just never do. But these are incredibly important things, and nobody teaches you that, right? And so going back to like utility of knowledge, when you start to think about these things, they're never included in any curriculums, right? Despite how incredibly important they are. And we're all focused on, no, you have to learn geometry. Do you? Because that came with a cost. You learn geometry, you learn what reflexive angles are, but you didn't learn how to spot a psychopath. And now you're married to a lunatic, right? Which one seems to be have greater utility? And you can, it's not a straightforward proposition necessarily. There's some things you need every day that can help you. I think everybody would benefit with some, just a 1 hour course in basic electricity, right? Save yourself a lot of trouble in life. Basic plumbing, just basic handyman, how to cook, right? A lot of people don't know how to cook, and they eat out and eat garbage their whole life. This is a useful skill. How to maintain relationships, how to spot psychopaths, all those things are important. How to make your own business, entrepreneurship. I would say 80% of it, 90% of it is actually just going out and trying something. Like, you might fail, but most people never try. And your competition is not as stiff as you think it is, because no one ever even tries, right? How do you teach that skill? Is that useful? And so many things, and we're so focused, and all these curriculums are still focused on teaching you science and biology and all these things. I'm not saying you don't think that's not useful knowledge, but there's other things that are more useful, right? That we don't teach, right? So these are the two sort of basic questions that sort of wraps around, what is it that we're supposed to teach our kids, that we should teach your kids? And I would say, to wrap up this nice, eloquent rant, that you have to sort of sit down and adjust. And one, have a goal in mind. And then two, sort of answer the question of what are useful things for your kids to know. Like a lesson to give even a young kid, 7, 8 years old, would greatly benefit in just one lesson in basic first aid, like how to tell if daddy's having a heart attack, right? Could save your life, right? These kind of basic questions, right? That lots of kids would benefit, lots of families would benefit from, right? Basic nutrition, just there's so many things. Create, I know that, we used to have shop class when I was a kid. Now that you can't let kids around power tools, because Lord knows what would happen. The world would end if somebody got hurt. But they used to let you injure yourself. That was part of growing up. But some basic, just handyman skills. Like it's remarkable how many college kids grow up now that are just useless. They're just useless. I'm just going to go on a rant, but those are the questions I think you need to ask when approaching any kind of curriculum, homeschool curriculum, alternative curriculum. There's all this world schooling, unschooling, all those kind of things. Understand that you have to have a goal. Set goals, yearly goals, multi-yearly goals, whatever. Have some goal in mind. Know that have some destination that you're traveling to, and then you can begin to decide what is the useful things to get you there, right? Makes sense. It's kind of a non-answer, but it's an answers a question with more questions, which is always the best. So that's my little rant on what it is that you should be teaching your kids, right? Is that you have to answer some questions first.